Section 8 of the Rural Magazine and Literary Evening Fireside, Volume 1, Number 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rural Magazine and Literary Evening Fireside, Volume 1, Number 1, by Various. Mr. Nicholson's prize essay on a rotation of crops, and the most profitable mode of collecting, preserving, and applying manures, communicated to the Albany County Agricultural Society. Some soils are peculiarly adapted for the growth of particular plants, and in such case many successive yearly growths of them may be raised, without manure, and without material diminution of product. We have known an instance of 14 good crops of wheat raised successively on the same ground, another of 18 crops of oats, others of at least 10 of barley, and nearly of 20 rye. But these were peculiar soils, and although this sameness of culture was found successful, no inference is therefore to be drawn that it was the most profitable, or that such soils would not eventually tire of their favorite crops, and then be found exhausted and unfit for others. Generally speaking, we conceive that one of the most important points in husbandry is a judicious rotation of such crops as are most profitable for culture, and at the same time best adapted for the particular soils which are to be cultivated. Lands seem naturally to require a change of growths. Where the oak has disappeared, after it had lifted its head to the springs of ages, another oak will not naturally rise, but some other tree. Instances have been known of lands covered solely with trees of deciduous growth, where the knots of the pitch pine were still to be found, a proof that pine was once a tenant of the soil. In the southern states, where lands have been exhausted with injudicious cropping, and then thrown out to common, they soon become covered with growths of trees different from those they originally bore. Some plants are so unfit for long continuance in any particular place that they are endowed with migratory powers, either by their winged seeds, which are wafted abroad by the winds, by their roots, by which they change their places of growth beneath the surface, or by their vines, by which they travel above ground, and thus locate themselves in different situations. Of the first description are the varieties of the thistle, the milkweed, and the fireweed. Of the second, the potato and some other bulbous-rooted plants. Of the third, the strawberry, the blackberry, the different species of the gourd tribe. The stalks of erect plants fall when they ripen, and thus the seed reaches the ground at a distance from the roots which produce them. There seems, indeed, to be generally a disposition in the earth to require changes in the plants it nourishes, in order that it may impart the food that is best adapted for each, and Providence, in His infinite wisdom, has endowed these while growing in a state of nature, with such properties as are best calculated to effect the changes. Let the cultivator, therefore, study nature, and follow her dictates, if he wishes either success or applause in his employment. In regard to changes of crops, a general rule has been recommended of alternate growths of leguminous and culmiferous kinds, and of green crops and grain crops. But perhaps it would be quite as philosophical to insist upon alternate growths of fibrous and tap-rooted plants, the former deriving their food from the surface of the earth, the latter from greater depths. But the value of crops, and the expense of raising each, should be duly estimated in making selections for rotations. Let us say, for instance, that the average crops of wheat, barley, and Indian corn, at their greatest extent, may average $50 in value to the acre, after the grain is ready for market. Crops of rye, oats, and peas, not more than 2/3 of this amount. Buckwheat, considerably less. From land suitable for rutabaga or mangel wurzel, it would seem that from 5 to 600 bushels to the acre may be expected with good culture, which at 18 cents per bushel, a price certainly not beyond the proportionate value we have just given to the grain crops, will average about $100 to the value of an acre. The entire expense of either of these crops of roots, when ready for use, is not essentially greater than the expense incurred in producing grain crops. Of course, it must be evident that these afford from $30 to $50 an acre less of clear profit than a crop of either of the roots first mentioned. With a proper application of the requisite quantity of manure to rutabaga, it may be successfully grown on almost any dry soil, when well and deeply mellowed, from the sandy to the deep rich loams. Soils of the latter description are best adapted for mangel wurzel. Either of these roots, when steam boiled, and especially with the addition of some meal, will answer all the purposes for which grain is used for feeding cattle of all sorts, from the horse down to the hog. Even stage horses, which, from the severity of their labour, require the most nourishing food, having been kept in England on hay and steam-boiled rutabaga. Mr. Corbett says, "A hog of a good sort may be sufficiently fatted with this root when steam-boiled, allowing, what we believe can hardly be admitted, that a bushel of oats contains as much nutriment as 3 of this root. Still it is evident that the usual product of 1 acre of it will go as far in keeping horses as 4 of oats. Neither of these root crops require any considerable expenditure in seed, and on this account, if no other, they are preferable to crops of the potato and of the Jerusalem artichoke, which in the article of seed are perhaps the most expensive of any whatever. We however consider crops even of these roots more profitable than those of grain, and particularly the potato, when judiciously cultivated in climates most suitable for its growth. For the various uses of this root for culinary purposes it stands indeed without a rival. In point of profit we would also give to the carrot, the parsnip, and the onion, a preference to crops of grain, but the soils well adapted for them is more limited, and their culture is more expensive. And although they should form a part of the products of the farm we cannot recommend them as being in all instances proper for a judicious rotation of crops. The common turnip and the cabbage are also entitled to attention. The pumpkin is as nutritious as the same weight of any root or vegetable whatever, and its culture is cheap. But whether its product, in weight, can be made to compete with that of roots, is a matter of which we are not informed. If 15 tons to the acre could be usually obtained of this species of gourd, we should be induced to pronounce the crop, in point of profit and use, unrivalled as a preparative for a crop of winter grain. The crop would be found among those which are least expensive in seed, in culture, and in gathering. None would occasion less exhaustion of soil, nor require less for manure, as a little gypsum to the hills, or drills, to be found to have a powerful effect on its growth. But of its more complete cultivation we shall presently speak. In Pennsylvania, and farther to the south, a successful mode of culture has been put in practice of growing Indian corn and potatoes in alternate rows or drills, and in this way about 1/6 more of product in the aggregate is obtained from the ground, than if these 2 sorts of crops were cultivated separately. Such is found to be the fact, and the reason for it seems to be that each crop has, in this way, more space given for the extension of its roots in search of its favorite food, and each has the like room above ground for deriving from the air the nutriment that is most suitable. Corn, in particular, it is well known, is liable to much injury, if planted too closely. There is, indeed, a variety of cases where this mingling of growths is found very advantageous, and whenever we shall venture to recommend the practice, it will be founded on a conviction of its utility. There are also some instances, even in this northern latitude, in which two crops may be had in a season from the same ground, and any case where it may be advisable shall be duly noted. It should farther be observed that in suggesting what may be deemed the most suitable changes of crops, no reference will be had to the actual state of farming among us, but merely what the state of farming ought to be, and in pursuance of this course, we shall, in a great measure, discard the idea, too long prevalent in this country, that we should make the most of our labor, not the most of our land. We shall, on the contrary, insist that, generally speaking, making the most of our lands, under a proper course of husbandry, is the right way to realize the most from our labor. We shall, therefore, begin with the most usual soil of this country, the dry, arable lands, which are usually suited for a variety of crops, of the stiff clays, the hard gravels, and light sands, soils which abound but little here. We shall speak in particular. In plowing we shall advise that the usual depth be about 6 inches, or about a third deeper than our farmers commonly plow, but that the depth should sometimes be greater than this, and sometimes less. We shall also insist on the plowing being done in the most perfect manner, and not in the slight way too often practiced. And we shall farther premise that the plan of culture we recommend is necessarily connected with the business of the dairy, to greater or less extent, and with that of the grazier, in feeding and fatting cattle of every description. Such we conceive to be the only true and profitable course to conduct farming in this country. But deviations from this may in some cases be found equally profitable. In general, however, we advise to this course of farming, for in this way the greatest quantity of manure is afforded, and for the most lands manure is essential for obtaining the greatest crops, and of course for realizing the greatest profits. We shall begin with the ground in wheat or rye stubble, as at the end of our course we propose to leave it. Let the stubble ground be well turned over in the fall, to the depth of, say, 6 inches. It should not be turned over until a sward of white clover has covered the ground, which is to be produced by giving it a top dressing of gypsum in the spring. Under the subject of manures the reasons for this will be explained when treating of gypsum. In the spring give the ground 1 or 2 plowings more, as the nature of the soil may require, and of the same depth, and let the last plowing be just before the proper time for planting Indian corn, for this crop, with an intermixture of other plants, is what we propose to begin with. Say, for instance, that the intermixture shall consist of the potato, of the pumpkin, and of the common pumpkin, a third part of each. We propose planting these crops in drills, in preference to hills, from a well-founded conviction that in the former method considerably more may be obtained from the ground. Let furrows be run, at a good depth, for the drills, at the distance of about every 3½ feet. In these furrows, lay off the shortest and best of the fresh barn dung, at the rate of about 20 wagon loads to the acre. For the drills intended for potatoes the longer sort of barn dung is as good as any other. If the different sorts of barn dung can be applied to the soils most suitable for each, as is mentioned in speaking of manures, this should always be attended to, that is, sheep and horse dung for the moister parts of the land, and cow dung for the drier. As fast as the dung is laid, it should be well covered, by a furrow, moderately deep, thrown over it from each side, but where potatoes are to form the alternate drills, let the seed for these be laid on the dung, previous to covering, And for this purpose, let the potatoes be cut in halves, lengthways, so as to give each about an equal number of eyes, and then wet them and roll them in gypsum before laying them down, which should be at the distances of about 15 inches, the potato drills being thus covered by the furrows thrown from each side. The same process serves to cover the dung in the other furrows, and thus the beds are formed for planting the other crops in the drill method. Indian corn may be drilled in at one operation by a drill machine for the purpose. The same may be observed of the turnip crop, and probably of the pumpkin, but though attended with more labor, it may usually be expected that they will be drilled in by manual operation. We should advise that the seed in the turnip drills be liberally strewn, in order that if part of the plants be destroyed by the flies, enough may still be left. The corn and pumpkin seed may be dropped at the distances of 6 inches, and thinned at the first hoeing, so as to have the growing plants of the former about a foot apart, and the latter about 16 inches. If any vacant places should happen in any of these drills, such vacancies may readily be supplied by transplanting sets, taken from parts where more plants are standing than are necessary. Any young plants may be transplanted after they have attained a suitable size, which is usually in from 2 to 4 weeks' growth. The vacancies may be quickly filled by transplanting, and it is a matter well worthy of attention. The practice, lately introduced, of laying barn dung at a good depth, and then covering it with mold to the depth of about 3 or 4 inches, and planting the seeds over the manure thus covered, seems to answer the best purpose for every drilled crop except potatoes, and we would therefore recommend this method of using barn dung in preference to every other, as far as it may be wanted for drilled crops. In this way this manure may be profitably applied while fresh, but in many instances we consider it more efficacious when applied after the process of rotting or fermentation has commenced. Such is the theory of Sir Humphry Davy, and we have full confidence in its correctness. When thus buried in the earth, the growing plants, placed above the manure, have the utmost means of absorbing all its garious and soluble parts, while the process of its decomposition is going on. In preparing seeds we would, as a general rule, advise to their being soaked about 12 hours in a strong solution of saltpetre or of common salt, and then rolled in gypsum before being committed to the earth. The effect of this mode of preparing the seed seems to be, that the young plants start with more vigor, and grow larger than they do where this treatment of the seed is neglected, and the solution of saltpetre has the further effect of bringing plants to maturity from 1 to 2 weeks sooner than they otherwise would ripen. In selecting seed for the corn crop, take such stalks as bear 2 ears, and select the best ear from each of such stalks, the grains on each end to be rejected. In all cases where it is practicable, the seed should be taken from the largest and most perfect plants, or roots, as the case may be. By attending to this mode of selecting seed, the product of the corn crop in particular will soon be found greatly augmented, a discovery, the honor of which is due to Mr. Cooper, of New Jersey. It is said that sprinkling a little gypsum on the silk of the ears of corn will make them fill to the ends. Nipping off the blossoms of the potato crop, as fast as they appear, is found, by accurate experiment, to increase the growth of the roots about 1/6 part. Salt and gypsum have each a powerful effect on their growth, though by applying too much of the latter it may cause them to run too much to vines. To the corn and pumpkin crop apply some of this latter manure after the plants are up. What effect it has on turnips we have never understood. In plowing between the drills let it be to a good depth, first turning the furrows from the plants, running about 4 inches from them, and then turning the furrows back, when the hoeing and hand weeding are to follow. The second plowing should be similar to the first, but farther from the plants, and in general, we believe, it will be found advantageous to plow and hoe the crops the third time. We have seen it highly recommended to plow among Indian corn as late as in August. Frequent deep plowing is certainly the best means of keeping the ground moist, and should never be omitted in case of drought. Ground that has become quite dry will be found moist after a thorough deep plowing. At all events, the ground should be so cultivated as to prevent any weeds from going to seed in the fall, for if this be suffered, the ground will remain constantly stocked with the seeds of weeds. We advise to the cultivation of the common turnip, the potato, and the pumpkin, in the manner we have mentioned, for the purpose of affording the early supply of food for feeding and fatting cattle in the fall and the forepart of the winter, before the rutabaga crop should be used, of which we shall presently speak. We also advise to this variety of crops, in order that the cattle may have a greater variety of food, a matter of considerable importance in feeding and fatting cattle. For this purpose also the culture of the cabbage is worthy of attention. Horses, and all sorts of cattle, fatten well on pumpkins, but for swine they should be steam boiled, and the seeds taken out, as these prove injurious to those animals, by causing too great a secretion of urine. The seeds afford an oil equal to that of the olive, and are well worth preserving for this purpose. As soon as the ears of the corn crop have somewhat hardened, the crop may be cut up and set in shocks, with the tops tied closely together to keep out the rains, in which way the grain will harden as well as in any other, and a great addition of fodder may thus be acquired. During the next season we propose to take crops from the ground, to wit, a crop of rutabaga, preceded by such spring crop as ripens sufficiently early to be harvested in time for preparing the ground for a full growth of this root. In the Meridian of New York, Mr. Corbett says that from the 26th of July until some of the first days in August is the proper time to transplant this crop, the plants for the purpose being previously grown. The method of cultivating the crop by transplanting, he insists, is the preferable way, and from our own experience we are fully disposed to agree with him. Advancing to the northward, from New York, the seasons are shorter, and of course the crop should be transplanted earlier, while at the same time the spring crops are later in ripening. At New York, barley could be taken from the ground in time sufficient for preparing for rutabaga. Farther to the north, this could not be the case. In the more northerly parts of this state, it would, perhaps, be difficult to find any crop now raised in this country, with the exception of flax, that would be sufficiently early. The fact is, we want a particular crop for this purpose, and that would seem to be the new sort of spring wheat lately introduced into France, which is there called le bleu de mai, in English, the wheat of May. It is said to be a very productive species of wheat, affording a grain from which flour is made of about a medium whiteness between that of rye and wheat, and in that country it is fit to harvest in the latter end of May. In this state it would probably ripen nowhere later than the 1st of July, which would be in time sufficient for the crop of rutabaga. Until we can produce this wheat, we can only recommend that the preceding crop be such only as will ripen sufficiently early, and where none can be had for the purpose, to be content with raising the crop of rutabaga only in the course of the season. Where previous spring crops can however be obtained, let them be taken from the ground as quick as possible, and the ground deeply turned over, and mellowed by 3 deep plowings, then furrowed at the distances of about 30 inches, the manure laid in, and covered by furrows thrown over it from each side, and the plants of rutabaga immediately set on the ridges, by transplanting at the distance of about a foot from each other. From our own experience we are fully convinced that the plan of transplanting is, in the end, much the cheapest, and most advisable. We would, however, recommend not to transplant before the appearance of a heavy shower, but at any time afterwards, that the plants be of good size, say of 5 or 6 weeks' growth, and that in setting, special care be taken to have the lower parts of the roots well enclosed with earth. For further particulars in regard to the culture of this crop, the time and manner of using it, and of saving it, we refer the reader to Mr. Corbett's book on the subject, from a conviction that it is the best essay that has ever been published on the culture and use of this valuable plant. It will be seen, however, that we differ from Mr. C. in the distances in which the plants are to be set, and in the manner of forming the ridges. He forms his ridges by 4 gathering furrows, by which the ridges are each about 4 feet in breadth. We propose to form the ridges by 2 gathering furrows, and at the distances of 30 inches. In England, the plan we recommend is generally pursued, and the ridges are usually but 27 inches wide. To be continued. End of section 8.